Welcome to this gentle journey through the forgotten life of Viking farmers, the quiet, resilient people who lived beyond the shadow of the raids. We often think of Vikings as fierce warriors, sea raiders, and legendary explorers, but there was another side to their world, one that was grounded in survival, community, and the slow, steady rhythm of the land. Imagine waking up in the early morning light. The air is crisp, the horizon painted with the soft hues of dawn. You step outside, feeling the cold earth beneath your feet. The world is vast, and yet it feels contained, manageable. The farmer's life, unlike the warrior's, is not defined by the clash of swords or the roar of ships, but by the quiet persistence of work that must be done every day, no matter the weather, no matter the season. As the sun rises higher in the sky, you begin your day's tasks tilling the soil, tending to the livestock, or perhaps gathering herbs and wild berries that will feed your family through the coming months. It's a life of simple yet profound purpose. The rhythm of planting, growing, and harvesting is not just a way to survive, is the heartbeat of Viking culture. Where are you watching from? We'd love to hear where you are in the world, as we take you back to a time when the harsh winters of the north demanded resilience and ingenuity. Leave us a comment and let us know what brought you here. Whether it's your interest in Viking history, a love for the past, or simply the calm that history can bring at the end of a long day. The Viking farmer's life may seem distant, but it's a reminder of how human beings, throughout time, have had to adapt, survive, and find meaning in the cycles of nature. We hope this story soothes you as you drift off into sleep, wrapped in the rhythms of a world long past. Until then, let's step into the fields of the Viking Age and learn how the farmers lived, worked, and thrived beyond the battles and legends. Part 1. The Viking World, Beyond the Raids. The Viking Age, often romanticized for its warriors and pillaging, is often overshadowed by the dramatic stories of raids and longships cutting through the waves. But there's another, quieter story, one that takes place in the fields, on the farms, and within the homes of those who didn't go raiding, but who lived and thrived in the harsh lands of the north. In this scene, we'll take a soft meditative journey into that forgotten world, the life of the Viking farmer, a life grounded not in war but in the cycles of nature, the grind of daily labor, and the rhythms of survival. It's early morning, and the world is still shrouded in the cool blue of dawn. The land around you stretches wide and green, dotted with small farmsteads and clustered villages nestled in the rolling hills. The air is thick with the scent of dew and earth, and if you listen closely you can hear the distant sound of birds calling to one another, the soft rustle of the wind as it moves through the tall grass. This was the land of the Viking farmer, a life of hard work, steady determination, and resilience. While the legends of Viking warriors, those fierce, sea-born conquerors, they're often loud and dramatic, the lives of the farmers who remained at home were much quieter, though no less important. In fact, without the farmers, the Viking raids and wars would not have been possible at all. It was their ability to farm, to grow food, to create the tools and materials that supported a growing population that allowed Viking society to flourish. Farmers were the lifeblood of Viking society. They were the ones who cultivated the land, raised livestock, and provided the sustenance that kept everyone else going. Without their hard work, there would have been no warriors to fight, no ships to build, and no settlements to protect. In a sense, the Viking farmer was as much a part of the Viking saga as the raiders themselves. As the sun begins to rise higher, its rays warm the cold ground, and the world begins to come alive. The first task of the day is often the tending of animals. The Viking farmer would make his way to the barn to check on the livestock: cows, sheep, goats, and sometimes pigs. These animals were not just sources of food, they were valuable commodities in Viking society. Cows and sheep provided milk, wool, and meat, while goats were often used for their milk and hides. Pigs were a prized source of protein, especially in the winter months, when fresh food was harder to come by. Once the animals are tended to, the farmer moves on to other tasks. In the fields, there's always something to do. The soil is tilled, seeds are planted, and weeds are pulled. These tasks, though seemingly simple, were essential to the survival of the Viking community. Farming in the north was no easy feat. The growing season was short, and the winters were long and harsh. Yet, despite these challenges, the Vikings were skilled farmers, using innovative techniques to make the most of the land. They knew when to plant, when to harvest, and how to store their crops to survive through the winter months. But farming was not just about survival, it was also about sustenance and comfort. The Vikings grew a variety of crops, including barley, oats, rye, and wheat. These grains were the staple of their diet, used to make bread, porridge, and ale. Root vegetables like turnips, carrots, and onions were also cultivated, as were legumes such as peas and beans. These crops provided essential nutrients during the long, dark months when fresh produce was scarce. The Viking farmstead, unlike the grand palaces of kings or the fortresses of warriors, was a modest affair. It consisted of a longhouse, a large, single-room building made of wood or stone surrounded by fields, barns, and animal pens. Inside the longhouse, the hearth was the center of daily life. It was here that meals were prepared, the family gathered, and warmth was found during the harsh winter nights. The hearth also served as a place for socializing, for telling stories, and for passing down the knowledge of how to farm, hunt, and live off the land. The family was the backbone of Viking society, and much of the work on the farm was a communal effort. Everyone had a role to play, from the youngest child to the oldest grandparent. While the men were typically responsible for heavier tasks like plowing, hunting, and herding, the women played a crucial role in managing the household, milking cows, preparing food, and tending the gardens. Children learned the ways of the land from an early age, helping with small tasks like gathering firewood or tending to the chickens. At harvest time, the whole family worked together to bring in the crops. The days were long, the work hard, but there was a sense of unity and purpose. The harvest was a time of both celebration and anxiety. Would there be enough food to last through the winter? Were the stores of grain sufficient? Were the animals well fed and prepared for the cold months ahead? The uncertainty of the winter months loomed over the Viking farmer, but so did the hope that through hard work and determination they would make it through. Life on a Viking farm was not without its hardships. There were long days of hard labor, harsh weather, and limited resources. But there was also a sense of connection to the land and to the cycle of life that gave the farmer a deep sense of purpose. Each season brought its own challenges and rewards. Spring was a time of planting and renewal, summer a time of growth and abundance, autumn a time of harvest and preparation, and winter a long, cold wait for the warmth and light of spring. During the long winters, when the fields were buried under snow and the days were short and dark, life slowed down. But even in the stillness of winter, there was work to be done. The Viking farmer would spend time mending tools, repairing buildings, and tending to the animals. It was also a time for storytelling and the sharing of knowledge. Around the hearth, families would gather to tell tales of gods and heroes, of ancient battles and legendary creatures. These stories helped to pass the long nights and kept the spirit of Viking culture alive, even in the darkest months. In addition to the everyday work of farming, the Viking farmer also had to deal with the unpredictability of nature. Storms could destroy crops, and animals could fall ill. Famine and disease were constant threats, and while the Vikings were known for their bravery in battle, it was their ingenuity and resilience in the face of adversity that truly defined them. They adapted to the challenges of the land, finding new ways to grow food, build homes, and protect themselves from the elements. What made Viking farming unique was not just the hard work, but also the deep connection to the land and the seasons. The Vikings didn't just farm to survive, they farmed to thrive, to create a life that was rich in community, in family, and in connection to the earth. They knew that the land could be both a source of sustenance and a source of spiritual meaning. Many Vikings believed that the land was sacred, and that the gods watched over the crops and animals. The connection between the farmer and the land was not just practical, it was spiritual. The Vikings also practiced rituals to ensure the health of their crops and livestock. These rituals were often tied to the changing of the seasons, marking the passing of time and the need to honor the gods. At harvest time, there would be feasts to celebrate the bounty of the land, and offerings would be made to the gods to ensure that the coming year would be as fruitful as the last. In this way, farming was not just a practical endeavor, was deeply woven into the fabric of Viking spirituality and culture. The life of a Viking farmer, while quiet compared to the raids and battles of their warrior kin, was no less important. It was a life of constant labor, but also of hope, resilience, and connection to the land. It was a life that allowed the Vikings to thrive in one of the harshest environments in Europe, and it provided the foundation upon which Viking society could flourish. These farmers were the unsung heroes of Viking civilization, working day in and day out to ensure that their families and communities survived and thrived through the changing seasons. Their story may be quieter, but it is no less significant, and in a way, it is a story that still resonates today as we look to the land for sustenance, comfort, and connection. Part 2. A day in the life of a Viking farmer. As the early morning mist begins to lift, the Viking farmer's day starts with the first light of dawn, the golden rays cutting through the cool, crisp air. The world around you is still quiet, the land untouched, and the only sound that reaches your ears is the faint rustling of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of birds welcoming the new day. The work ahead is steady, constant, and demanding, but there is a rhythm to it, a pulse, a beat that carries you from one task to the next with quiet purpose. Viking life was not dictated by the clock. Instead, it followed the natural rhythms of the earth, the sky, and the seasons. The tasks of the day would be determined by the time of year, the weather, and the needs of the farm. But whatever the task, it would always require patience, persistence, and a deep connection to the land. A Viking farmer's life was measured not by hours, but by the slow and steady progression of the day, the seasons, and the cycle of life itself. The first task of the day often began with the animals. The Viking farmer would make his way to the barn or the stable where the livestock was kept. These animals, whether cows, sheep, goats, or pigs, were vital to the farm's survival. They provided milk, meat, wool, and hides, and their care was of the utmost importance. The animals needed to be fed, watered, and tended to, ensuring their health and well-being. In a world without refrigeration, a sick animal could spell disaster for the family, so the Viking farmer would keep a watchful eye on each one, knowing them as well as he knew his own family. The cows were often the most important livestock, providing milk that would be used for butter, cheese, and even drinking. The Viking farmer would milk the cows early in the morning, filling pails with the fresh, warm liquid that would be used throughout the day. The goats, too, provided milk, as well as wool and skins, and the sheep offered wool for clothing and blankets to keep the family warm through the long, cold winters. As the farmer moved from one animal to the next, he might whistle or speak softly to them, comforting them in his own way, ensuring they were settled and content before moving on to the next task. After the animals were taken care of, the Viking farmer would step outside and breathe in the fresh air, taking in the scent of the earth, the grass, and the trees. There was always something that needed to be done on the farm. In the warmer months, the fields were alive with growth, and there was no shortage of work. The soil needed to be tilled and prepared for planting. The crops needed to be sown, and the weeds needed to be kept in check. This was where the Viking farmer truly connected with the land. With the tools of his trade simple, but effective, he would dig, hoe, and plow, feeling the earth give way beneath his hands and feet. Farming in the northern climes was no easy feat. The short growing season meant that every moment counted. The Viking farmer knew the land intimately. He understood the way the soil felt beneath his feet, the way the wind shifted when it was about to rain, the way the seasons changed, and how to read the sky for signs of weather. He was a skilled observer, a person who knew how to work with the land, not against it. Over time, these skills were passed down from generation to generation, each farmer learning the ways of the earth from his forebears, his family, and his community. In the spring, the Viking farmer would plant his crops, sowing seeds of barley, rye, oats, and wheat grains that would form the foundation of the Viking diet. These crops would be ground into flour, used to bake bread, make porridge, and brew ale. The Vikings were known for their strong, hearty bread, made from the grains they grew themselves. In addition to grains, the farmer would also plant vegetables like peas, beans, turnips, and carrots, as well as herbs like thyme, dill, and garlic. These vegetables were an essential part of the Viking diet, providing vitamins and minerals that were especially important during the long, dark winters when fresh food was scarce. As the day wore on, the work would continue. The Viking farmer might turn his attention to building or repairing tools, mending fences, or preparing the longhouse for the coming months. The longhouse, the heart of the Viking farmstead, was a place of refuge and warmth, where the family gathered to eat, sleep, and work. It was a single, large building, often built of wood or stone, with a central hearth that provided both warmth and light. The hearth was where meals were prepared, where the family came together at the end of the day to share stories, and where the warmth of the fire could be felt on even the coldest of nights. While much of the farm work was physical and demanding, there was also an important element of spiritual and cultural connection to the work. The Viking farmer, like many in ancient societies, believed that the land was sacred. It was not just a resource to be exploited, but a living entity to be respected and nurtured. Many Vikings believed that the gods watched over the land, the crops, and the animals. Rituals and offerings were made throughout the year to ensure the health of the land and to honor the spirits of the earth. These rituals were often performed at key points in the agricultural cycle, during planting, harvest, and in times of need or fear. The Viking farmer would offer prayers or leave small gifts for the gods, asking for blessings and protection. By mid-afternoon, the work would begin to slow, and the farmer would take a moment to rest, to enjoy the beauty of the land, and perhaps to reflect on the day's progress. The work was never truly done, but there were small victories in each task completed. Each seed planted was one step closer to a harvest. Each fence mended was one more defense against the unpredictable weather or the wild animals that might threaten the livestock. As the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, the Viking farmer might begin to prepare for the evening, knowing that the next day would bring more work, but also more connection to the land and the cycle of life. As the light wanes and the sky turns to hues of orange and pink, the family begins to gather in the longhouse. The day's work is over, and it is time for rest and rejuvenation. The hearth crackles, sending out warmth, and the scent of a meal fills the air. The food that has been prepared is simple but nourishing: bread, cheese, dried meats, and perhaps a hearty stew made with the vegetables harvested earlier in the season. The family sits down together, sharing food, stories, and laughter. The day's work is behind them, but the cycle continues, and tomorrow will bring more work, more tasks, and more life. As the evening wears on and the stars begin to appear overhead, the Viking farmer may spend a few moments outside, gazing up at the night sky. There is a quiet, serene beauty in the stillness of the night. The stars, the moon, the distant mountains all are reminders of the vastness of the world. But in that moment, the Viking farmer is grounded, connected to the land and to the universe. The day has come to an end, but the rhythms of life continue, unbroken and eternal. The work of the Viking farmer may not have been glamorous or dramatic, but it was essential to the survival and prosperity of Viking society. Without the dedication and hard work of the farmers, the warriors would have had no food, no tools, and no shelter. It was the farmers who cultivated the land, tended to the animals, and ensured that Viking culture could thrive, both in times of peace and in times of war. Their lives were shaped by the land, by the seasons, and by the unyielding passage of time. And while their work may have been quiet, it was no less important. Through their labor, they sustained the Viking way of life and kept the fire of their culture burning for generations to come. The Viking farmer's day was a cycle, a continuous loop of work, rest, and renewal. Each season brought its own challenges and rewards, but through it all, the farmer remained steadfast and resilient, connected to the land in a way that few could understand. And so, as the night falls and the world quiets down, the farmer rests, knowing that tomorrow will bring more work, more tasks, and more of the same, the slow, steady, and relentless march of time. But for now, there is peace. The work is done, and the cycle begins anew with the first light of dawn. Part 3. The land they tilled. Viking farming techniques. The land, stretching out before the Viking farmer, is more than just soil. It is a source of life, a provider, and a connection to the past. When the Vikings settled in the rugged, often harsh environments of Scandinavia, they knew that their survival depended on the land's ability to sustain them. But the land didn't simply give up its bounty willingly. It had to be worked, understood, and respected. The Viking farmer's relationship with the earth was one built on patience, skill, and a deep, almost spiritual understanding of the cycles of nature. In the early years of Viking settlement, the techniques they employed to make the land productive were shaped by necessity. The harsh climates of the north, with their short growing seasons and cold winters, demanded ingenuity. Farming was not simply a matter of planting crops and hoping for the best. It was a delicate balance of skill, effort, and careful attention to the natural world. The Vikings, known for their remarkable adaptability, developed agricultural practices that allowed them to not only survive but thrive in these demanding conditions. The first key to Viking farming was the choice of land itself. The Vikings were expert in selecting the most fertile plots for their farms. They knew that not all land was equal, and they had a keen eye for finding soil that was rich in nutrients, well drained, and exposed to enough sunlight to make farming viable. In areas like Norway, where the mountains are steep and the valleys narrow, farms were often located in the fertile lowlands, where rivers and streams could provide water for irrigation. These areas were prized for their ability to support a wide range of crops and livestock. When a Viking farmer first established a farm, the first task was clearing the land. Much of the land in Scandinavia was covered by dense forests, and clearing these forests to create farmland was no small feat. The Vikings used a variety of tools to clear the land, including axes, knives, and saws. They would chop down trees, remove the stumps, and burn the underbrush, turning once forested areas into open fields ready for planting. This was hard, exhausting work, but it was essential for creating the space needed to grow crops and raise livestock. Once the land was cleared, the next task was to prepare the soil for planting. The Vikings did not have plows powered by horses or oxen, as we might imagine in modern times. Instead, they relied on hand tools like spades, hoes, and wooden plows drawn by oxen. The oxen were strong, reliable animals, capable of pulling heavy loads, and they were invaluable in preparing the fields for planting. These wooden plows, though simple in design, were effective in turning the soil and creating furrows in which seeds could be planted. The Viking farmer knew that the land's fertility was precious, and that it had to be cared for to maintain productivity. Soil quality could easily be depleted by over-farming, so crop rotation was a key practice. By rotating the crops each year, the Viking farmer allowed the soil time to rest and regain its nutrients. Barley and oats were common crops, as these grains grew quickly and provided the foundation for the Viking diet. Barley was used to make bread and ale, two staples of the Viking diet. Rye and wheat were also cultivated, though they required more time and care to grow. The Viking farmer also planted legumes like peas and beans, which were excellent for improving soil quality. These plants fixed nitrogen in the soil, enriching it for future crops. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots were also grown, as they could be stored throughout the winter months and provided much-needed nutrients during the cold, dark days of the year. The Vikings also grew a variety of herbs, including garlic, onions, and dill, which were used for flavoring food and for medicinal purposes. With the growing season short, timing was crucial for Viking farmers. The first sign of spring brought with it a rush of activity, as the farmer prepared the fields and planted seeds. Spring also meant the return of livestock to the pastures, as the animals could now graze on the fresh grass. In the fall, the harvest would begin, and the Viking farmer would work tirelessly to gather the crops, ensure that they were stored properly, and prepare for the long winter months. The harvest was a time of both relief and anxiety. There was the joy of seeing the fruits of your labor, but also the nagging concern of whether the crops would be enough to sustain the family through the cold winter months. The act of harvesting was an important ritual in Viking farming. The crops were often gathered by hand, using sickles or reaping knives to cut the barley, rye, and other grains. The grain would then be bundled into sheaves and carried back to the farmstead. The harvest was a family event, and all hands would be needed to gather, thresh, and winnow the crops. Threshing, the process of separating the grain from the husk, was done by hand or with a simple threshing machine, and the winnowing, tossing the grain into the air to separate the chaff, was done on a windy day to allow the wind to blow away the lighter husks. The grain that was harvested would be stored in barns or granaries, built specifically to protect the precious food supply from the elements. These buildings were often raised on stilts to keep the grain dry and safe from pests. The Viking farmer knew the importance of proper storage, for once the crops were harvested, they had to last through the long, cold winter. The grain could be used for making bread, porridge, or ale, but it could also be ground into flour and stored for later use. One of the more ingenious techniques used by Viking farmers was the practice of drying and smoking food to preserve it. Meat, fish, and vegetables would be dried or smoked to ensure they would last through the winter months. This technique was especially important for preserving fish, which was a vital source of protein in the Viking diet. Drying and smoking meat and fish also helped keep these foods safe from spoilage, as the cold, dry air of winter could cause fresh food to rot quickly. Fish were often caught in the coastal waters, and after being dried or smoked, they were stored in large barrels or hung in smokehouses to be used throughout the year. The Viking farmer also raised animals, including cows, pigs, sheep, and goats. These animals provided a variety of resources that were essential for survival. Cows provided milk for butter and cheese, while pigs were raised for their meat. Sheep were valued for their wool, which was spun into thread and woven into clothing and blankets. Goats were kept for their milk and their ability to thrive on rough terrain, grazing in areas where other animals could not. The Viking farmer kept a watchful eye on his livestock, knowing that healthy animals meant the difference between survival and scarcity. Though farming in Viking times required hard labor and resourcefulness, it was also a deeply ingrained part of their way of life. There was a spiritual connection to the land, to the animals, and to the very seasons themselves. In a world where the seasons dictated everything from when to plant crops to when to harvest, there was a profound respect for nature's cycles. The farmer understood that his success was inextricably linked to the earth's bounty and to the seasons that governed it. During the colder months, when the fields lay dormant beneath a blanket of snow, the Viking farmer's life slowed. The work was less intense, but the preparation for the coming year continued. The longhouse was the center of family life during the winter, and this was the time when the tools of the trade would be mended, the animals tended to, and the farmstead repaired and prepared for the return of spring. The farmer would often spend these long winter nights sharpening tools, weaving cloth, or repairing the wooden plows and sledges that would be used when the snow began to melt. Throughout the year, the Viking farmer's life was governed by the rhythm of the seasons. Each task, from the planting of seeds to the harvest of crops, had its time and place. This cycle of life and work became a deeply embedded part of the Viking identity. To be a Viking farmer was not simply to work the land, it was to understand its mysteries, to work with it, and to live in harmony with its cycles. It was a life of constant labor, but also of quiet reward, knowing that with each passing season, the land would give back what was needed to survive. The Viking farmers' techniques were simple yet effective, honed over generations of trial and error. They did not have the luxury of modern machinery or synthetic fertilizers, but they did have something far more valuable: an intimate knowledge of the land, a respect for its rhythms, and an enduring connection to the earth that sustained them. Through their efforts, they not only fed their families, but also laid the foundation for the Viking world to endure long after the raids and battles faded into history. And so, as the seasons passed, the Viking farmer continued to till the soil, raise the animals, and maintain the connection to the earth that had sustained his people for centuries. The work never ended, but the rewards were subtle, found in the grain that grew in the field, the animals that thrived in the barn, and the knowledge that with each season's cycle, the land would continue to provide. It was a life that required both strength and patience, a life where every day brought a new opportunity to work, to learn, and to connect with the timeless rhythms of the earth. Part 4. The Viking Diet. Simple foods, endless strength. As the Viking farmer walks through his fields at the start of the day, the sun still low on the horizon, a sense of calm settles over him. The rhythm of the day is quiet, but steady tasks waiting, animals to tend, crops to grow, but food is always at the heart of his work. For the Vikings, food was not just sustenance, it was life itself, a vital thread that connected them to the land, to their ancestors, and to their future. The Viking diet was practical, hearty, and shaped by the environment in which the people lived. The Vikings were not extravagant eaters. Their food was simple, yet nourishing, and it supported their demanding lives as both farmers and warriors. The food they consumed was a reflection of their lifestyle: direct, efficient, and robust. It was built around what the land could offer, supplemented by what could be traded or captured. The Viking diet was shaped by necessity, and every meal was an acknowledgement of the work it took to provide for the family, the community, and the next generation. One of the main staples of the Viking diet was grain. Barley, rye, oats, and wheat were common crops on Viking farms, providing the foundation for much of their food. Barley was particularly important because of its versatility. It was used to make bread, which could be simple or elaborate, depending on the ingredients available. The Vikings also brewed ale from barley, which was a common drink for both adults and children. In fact, ale was so important in Viking society that it was often brewed for ceremonial occasions, feasts, and even offerings to the gods. The bread the Vikings made was often dense, made from ground barley or rye. Unlike the airy light loaves we might think of today, Viking bread was hearty and filling. This was essential for the kind of labor they performed day in and day out. When baking bread, Viking families would often use an open flame or an oven made of stone. The process of baking was a communal activity. The bread would be shared with everyone in the household, nourishing them for the long, strenuous days ahead. Alongside bread, porridge made from oats, barley, or rye was another significant part of the Viking diet. Porridge was easy to prepare, filling, and could be made in a variety of ways. It could be sweetened with honey or berries when they were available, or flavored with herbs. Porridge was a comforting dish, often eaten at the start of the day to fuel the Viking farmer before the hard labor began. It was simple but deeply satisfying, providing both energy and warmth. When it came to protein, the Vikings were skilled in utilizing both the land and the sea. Livestock was central to the Viking farm, with cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs being raised for their meat, milk, and other resources. Meat, especially pork, was a highly prized part of the diet, but it was also costly to raise. This meant that meat would often be preserved for special occasions or as a reserve for the colder months when fresh food was scarce. In addition to the animals they raised, the Vikings also hunted and fished. Fish played a key role in their diet, especially in coastal regions where the sea was abundant with life. Fish could be dried, smoked, or salted to preserve it for later use. Cod, salmon, and herring were some of the most common fish species consumed by the Vikings. These fish were high in protein and fat, providing essential nutrients that helped sustain the Vikings through their long, harsh winters. For the Vikings, preserving food was just as important as growing or hunting it. They did not have refrigerators or modern preservation techniques, so they relied on methods like salting, drying, and smoking to ensure that food lasted through the winter months. Meat, fish, and even some vegetables would be salted and dried, hanging from rafters or stored in cool, dry places until needed. This was particularly essential when the weather turned cold, as fresh food became more scarce and difficult to obtain. Dried fish, often stored in large quantities, was a vital source of protein during the long winter months. Dairy products were another major part of the Viking diet. Cows, sheep, and goats provided milk, which was used to make a variety of products. Cheese and butter were especially important, as they were both nutritious and could be preserved for long periods. Skyr, a thick yogurt-like dairy product, was also common in Viking society, particularly in Iceland. It provided much-needed protein and fat, essential for staying strong and healthy during the demanding seasons of the year. Even the Vikings' gardens contributed to their diet, though it was limited by the short growing season. Vegetables such as turnips, cabbage, onions, leeks, and carrots were grown in the fertile soil. These vegetables could be eaten fresh during the summer months, but were also stored for winter use, often preserved by pickling or fermentation. Herbs like garlic, dill, and thyme were used to flavor food, and wild plants like berries and mushrooms were foraged from the forests. Some Viking communities also cultivated fruit, like apples and pears, though the harsher climates of Scandinavia limited their production. The diet of the Vikings was a reflection of their environment. It was shaped by what could grow, what could be raised, and what could be traded. A Viking farmer knew that he needed to take care of the land to ensure a steady supply of food, and the community understood that the welfare of one was tied to the welfare of all. Sharing was at the heart of the Viking diet. The meals were simple, but the act of coming together to share food was of great importance. Feasts, though not frequent, were an important part of Viking culture, especially after a successful raid or harvest. During these times, there would be an abundance of food and drink, and the whole community would come together to celebrate. In these feasts, Viking communities would often indulge in meats that were not part of their everyday diet, such as roast lamb, goat, or venison. These meals would be accompanied by large quantities of ale or mead, the fermented honey drink that was especially favored during celebratory times. Bread, cheese, butter, and porridge were always present, ensuring that no one went hungry, no matter their station or role within the community. For the Viking farmer, food was never taken for granted. There was a deep respect for the land's ability to provide. The hardships of farming and hunting were understood, but so too was the bounty that the land could offer. There was a spiritual connection to food, the knowledge that the earth, the animals, and the seasons worked together to create what was needed for survival. As the Viking farmer sits down for a meal after a long day's work, the food before him is not just nourishment, it is a symbol of the life he leads. The bread, the cheese, the milk, the preserved meat, all of it has been earned through labor, respect for nature, and an understanding of the cycles of life. The simple act of eating is a reminder of the work that went into creating that meal, and it is a small moment of peace in the ongoing rhythm of life. As the fire crackles in the hearth and the family gathers around the table, there is a deep sense of gratitude. This food, this life, is enough. It sustains, nourishes, and strengthens. As the day comes to a close and the darkness of night envelops the land, the Viking farmer rests, knowing that he has done his part. The meal he has eaten will fuel him for the challenges of tomorrow. There is satisfaction in knowing that the cycle continues. There will always be more work, more meals, more days to live, but each moment is a precious one, a gift from the land that sustains him. In the world of the Vikings, food was a bridge between the past and the future. It was the link that bound them to their ancestors, who had learned to live off the land, and to their children, who would inherit the same responsibility. The Viking farmer did not only work the land for his own benefit, he worked it to ensure the survival and prosperity of his community, his culture, and his legacy. The rhythms of eating, working, and living were deeply intertwined. The food they ate fueled their bodies, and the land they worked sustained their souls. The Viking diet was simple yet profound, and it was through the connection to food that the farmer, the warrior, and the entire Viking society survived and thrived in the harsh landscapes of the north. And as the fire burns low in the hearth, the cycle continues, and the land whispers its promise: tomorrow will come, and with it, new food to be grown, harvested, and shared. Part 5. Viking Longhouses. The heart of the Viking family. The Viking longhouse stands as a symbol of strength and resilience. It is more than just a place of shelter, it is the beating heart of Viking society, a place where the rhythms of daily life unfold, and where the community comes together to share meals, stories, and work. To the Viking farmer, the longhouse is both home and workplace, a refuge from the cold, and a center for family life. The longhouse, with its simple yet robust design, was a marvel of Viking craftsmanship. Built from timber, stone, and turf, it was designed to withstand the harsh northern climates of Scandinavia. Its long, narrow structure was suited to the needs of the Viking family, offering ample space for both living and storage. The roof, steep and sloping, was thatched with straw or covered in sod, ensuring that the warmth from the fire inside would be trapped and that the house would be insulated against the biting cold outside. Inside the longhouse, warmth radiated from the central hearth, which burned brightly in the middle of the room. This fire was not only the source of heat, it was the heart of the longhouse, providing light, warmth, and a place to cook. The longhouse would have been dark and cool during the winter months, but the flickering flames of the hearth brought the room to life. Around this fire, families gathered at the end of the day, sharing stories, meals, and the warmth of their company. The hearth was a sacred space, where the Viking family could bond, reflect, and rest together. The layout of the longhouse was simple, yet practical. At one end of the house was the hearth, where the fire burned day and night. Along the sides of the longhouse were raised platforms, used for sleeping. These platforms were covered with furs and blankets, providing a place for each member of the family to rest. There was no sense of privacy in the Viking longhouse. Space was communal, and everyone worked and lived together in close quarters. It was a space where bonds were formed and maintained, where the well-being of the individual was tied to the well-being of the family and the community. In the early mornings, the longhouse was often filled with activity. The warmth from the hearth would gradually begin to thaw the chill of the night, and the sounds of daily life would fill the air. The women of the household would be busy preparing breakfast, often a simple meal of porridge made from oats, barley, or rye. They might also make bread or cheese, depending on what the family had in store. The men would head out to tend the animals or work the land, while children played or helped with small chores. The sound of tools being sharpened, the clatter of wood being chopped, and the occasional voice calling out to the animals would echo throughout the longhouse. As the day wore on, the longhouse would grow quieter, and the rhythm of the day would shift. The family would work together, completing tasks as needed, whether it was repairing tools, weaving cloth, or maintaining the structures of the house itself. The longhouse was not just a shelter, it was a living, breathing space that required constant care. The thatched roof needed to be repaired periodically to keep out the rain and snow, and the walls would be reinforced to ensure that the house could withstand the weight of winter. Even in the coldest months, when the snow piled high outside, the longhouse remained a place of shelter and safety. As night fell, the longhouse would come alive with the quiet murmur of conversation and the gentle crackle of the fire. Families would sit together, eating their evening meal, usually a hearty stew or roasted meat, along with bread and dairy products like cheese and butter. The food was simple, but it provided the nourishment needed to face the challenges of the day. After the meal, the family would often sit around the fire, listening to stories passed down through the generations. Elders would recount tales of their ancestors, of battles fought and victories won, or of the gods and legends of the Viking world. These stories not only entertained, but also served as a way to pass on knowledge and traditions, ensuring that the next generation would carry on the legacy of the Viking people. The longhouse was a place where the seasons, too, left their mark. During the cold winter months, when the wind howled outside, the longhouse provided a sense of warmth and safety. Inside, the fire burned steadily, and families gathered together to wait out the long, dark nights. The winter was a time of rest, but also a time for preparing for the coming year. Tools were mended, and clothing was repaired or woven anew. The longhouse was filled with the quiet, steady work of the winter months, as families prepared for the challenges that the warmer seasons would bring. In the spring, the longhouse would once again become a place of renewal. The family would begin to work the land, planting crops and tending to animals. The longhouse, which had stood strong throughout the winter, would become a place of activity once more, as the Viking farmer prepared for the year ahead. The sounds of the hearth would be joined by the sounds of tools being used to clear the fields and tend to the gardens. The longhouse became a place of hard work, but also of hope that the coming season would bring prosperity and plenty. At the end of each day, as the fire in the hearth slowly burned down to glowing embers, the longhouse would grow quiet. The family would settle into their platforms for the night, the warmth of the fire lingering in the air. The darkness outside seemed to press in, but inside the longhouse, the family found peace and comfort. The work of the day was done, and the rhythms of daily life, which had been repeated for centuries, would continue. In a world where the days were filled with work and uncertainty, the longhouse provided a constant. It was a place where the Viking farmer and his family could rest, reflect, and find strength in each other. The longhouse was the heart of the Viking home, where family bonds were forged and tested, and where the shared responsibility of survival was met with quiet resolve. The Viking longhouse was also a place of celebration. When the harvests were bountiful or a great victory had been won, the family and community would gather in the longhouse to celebrate. The meal would be larger, the drink more abundant, and the laughter and joy more infectious. These moments of celebration were essential to the Viking way of life, as they marked the triumphs and successes of the community. Even in the darkest times, the longhouse was a place where people could come together and find joy, even if only for a moment. As the fire flickered low and the household settled into sleep, the Viking longhouse held the memories of the day, of the years that had passed, and of the generations yet to come. It was a space where life unfolded in all its complexity, a place where work, rest, joy, and sorrow were all woven together, creating the tapestry of Viking life. And so, as the cold winter winds howled outside, the Viking family slept soundly, knowing that the longhouse would keep them safe. Tomorrow, they would rise to face the work of the new day. But for now, they rested in the warmth and security that their home provided. The longhouse was a symbol of the Viking spirit, resilient, enduring, and always ready to face whatever challenges the future might bring. And as the fire burned low in the hearth, the family drifted into peaceful slumber, wrapped in the comforting embrace of their longhouse, their home, and their history. Part 6. Viking Trade, the flow of goods and knowledge. The Viking world, though known for its fierce warriors and far-reaching raids, was also a world of intricate trade and exchange. For the Viking farmer, trade was essential to survival and prosperity. Whether they lived in the quiet countryside or in one of the bustling coastal villages, the Vikings understood that their strength as a people came not just from their ability to fight, but from their ability to trade. Trade linked them to distant lands, and it was the foundation upon which many of their daily lives rested. As the Viking farmer wakes with the dawn, there is work to be done in the fields and the barn. But it is also a day for preparing goods for trade. The markets are not far weather. It is a coastal trading post, a riverside village, or an inland settlement. In the Viking world, trade was more than a mere exchange of goods. It was a way of connecting with others, of bringing in what was needed, and of sharing what was surplus. The Vikings were not just raiders, they were savvy traders, and this skill helped them thrive. Viking trade was a network that spanned from the icy waters of the North Atlantic to the warm shores of the Mediterranean. The Vikings traded with peoples from the British Isles, the Baltic states, the Eastern European lands, and even as far as Byzantium and the Arab world. They traded in goods as varied as furs, amber, slaves, iron, and timber, as well as the more luxurious items they obtained from their travel silks, spices, and precious metals. For the Viking farmer, the act of trading was an essential part of life, ensuring that the community could thrive through the exchange of goods, but also through the exchange of knowledge. As the sun rises over the farmstead, the Viking farmer prepares for the day's trading venture. The grain harvest from last year's crop has been stored, but now it is time to trade it for something that might be needed for the next season, perhaps tools, weapons, or even livestock. Along with grains, the farmer also has butter, cheese, and meat that can be exchanged. These items, though common in the Viking diet, are valuable to other communities who do not have the same resources. The exchange of food for other goods strengthens the ties between neighboring settlements, ensuring that each community is not self-sufficient but interdependent. And this interdependence is what makes the Viking world so resilient. The farmer's journey to the marketplace may take him through rugged terrain, perhaps along a river, or even across the sea in a longship, if his farm is near the coast. The Viking longship, so central to Viking society, was not only a vehicle for raids but also for trade. These ships, sleek and agile, could carry goods between far-flung parts of the Viking world. From the icy waters of Scandinavia to the warm shores of the Mediterranean, the Vikings were master shipbuilders, and their vessels made long-distance travel and trade possible in ways that other civilizations could only dream of. It was in these ships that Viking merchants, often the farmers themselves, could carry their goods to the bustling ports and markets that stretched from the North Sea to the Black Sea. As the Viking farmer sails across the water or walks through the dense forests to reach the market, he is aware of the importance of these exchanges. At the marketplace, he will meet others from distant lands. Some may be Slavic traders from the east, others might come from the British Isles or even from the Arab lands. These merchants bring their own goods to trade, perhaps spices, wool, gold, or textile items that the Viking farmer could not make or obtain by themselves. The Vikings were known to trade in ambra, precious commodity found along the shores of the Baltic Sea, and furs from the animals they hunted. These goods, though simple by today's standards, were highly valued by other cultures. In exchange for these goods, the Viking farmer may trade for tools, which could be used to improve his land, or for weapons, which could be vital in times of conflict. The acquisition of iron, for instance, was essential for forging plows and axes, tools that were crucial for both farming and defense. Weapons, too, such as swords, spears, and shields, would be traded or crafted in the settlement's smithy. These items were valuable for the Vikings, who valued strength and protection above all else. A well-crafted sword or axe could make the difference between life and death on a raid or in a battle for territory. But trade was not just about material good. It was also about the exchange of ideas. Viking traders would carry news from the far corners of their world. It was through trade that the Vikings were introduced to new technologies, religions, and cultural practices. The Byzantine Empire, with its wealth of knowledge and luxury goods, was one of the most influential regions in this exchange. Many Vikings who ventured to the east became familiar with Byzantine art, religious iconography, and even the Christian faith. Although the Vikings maintained their own Norse mythology, the Viking trading world was a cultural melting pot, where ideas and customs mixed, creating a vibrant and ever-evolving society. As the Viking farmer reaches the market, the bustle of the trade post fills his senses. The air is thick with the sounds of negotiation. of goods being exchanged, and of people from various cultures haggling over prices. It is a place where diplomacy and trade meet, where the Viking community can strengthen its ties to other cultures while securing the goods they need for survival. The farmer may find himself exchanging pleasantries with a Slavic merchant, bargaining for a few pieces of cloth or a horse. In another corner of the market, he might spot a Norwegian trader, with whom he shares a common ancestry, trading salt and timber for exotic spices. For the Viking farmer, the trade market is a vital space, not just for acquiring goods, but for fostering relationships. The marketplace is not only where material goods are exchanged, but where knowledge and community are built. The Viking way of life was inherently interconnected. No Viking was an island unto himself. The Vikings understood that their survival and success depended on cooperation, on the exchange of both material goods and intangible resources like information, knowledge, and stories. When the day is done and the market starts to close, the Viking farmer makes his way back home, his cart or ship now carrying new items. These will make life easier in the coming months. New tools, more livestock, maybe even something for a feast. As the sun sets over the water or the fields, the farmer reflects on the day's work. Though he will never forget the physical toil of farming, he understands that trade is equally important. It is through the exchange of goods and knowledge that his community thrives, and it is trade that links the Viking farmer to the wider world. Trade was a crucial aspect of Viking society, one that contributed not only to their economic prosperity, but also to their cultural richness. Through their far-reaching trade networks, the Vikings were able to acquire goods and resources that were otherwise unavailable to them. In doing so, they connected themselves to distant lands, forging bonds that would sustain their communities for generations. Trade made the Viking world more vibrant, more diverse, and more interconnected. It allowed the Viking farmer not just to survive, but to thrive. As the night falls and the Viking farmer settles into his home, he thinks about the exchange that took place that day, the goods, the stories, and the people he met. Tomorrow, the cycle will begin again, the work of farming, of trading, and of living. But for now, the fire crackles in the hearth, the warmth of the longhouse fills the air, and the Viking farmer rests, knowing that through trade, he is part of something far larger than his own small farmstead. He is part of a global network, stretching across seas, cultures, and time. The flow of goods and knowledge, like the flow of a river, is unbroken, and it will carry the Vikings through the trials of the future, just as it has carried them through the past. Part 7. Viking Farming and Food. Sustaining life through the seasons. The Viking farmer's life was deeply connected to the land. Their survival and prosperity were tied to the natural rhythms of the seasons, and their daily existence was shaped by the work of the fields, the tending of livestock, and the simple yet profound act of growing food. The land provided sustenance, and the Viking farmer had a deep respect for the cycles of nature, knowing that they must work in harmony with the earth to secure their survival. In the early spring, when the ice began to melt and the sun's warmth returned to the land, the farmer would begin preparing for the planting season. The soil, still damp from the winter's snow, needed to be worked, and the Viking farmer would spend long hours tilling the earth with a simple plow or hoe. The land would be prepared for the sowing of crops such as barley, oats, and wheat, the foundation of the Viking diet. These grains would provide flour for bread, porridge, and other essential meals. But it wasn't just grains that the Viking farmer grew. The land was also home to vegetables like cabbage, turnips, and onions, which added variety and nutrition to the Viking table. The seeds for the crops were carefully chosen and stored from the previous harvest, ensuring that they were hardy enough to withstand the unpredictable northern climate. In the early spring, the fields would be sowed, and the Viking farmer would hope for a good rain to nurture the plants. Spring was a season of hope and anticipation, though the farmer knew that the work was far from done. As the crops began to grow, the farmer's attention would turn to the livestock, which was just as essential to survival as the crops in the ground. The Vikings raised a variety of animals, including cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens. These animals provided meat, milk, and wool, all of which were vital to the farmer's household. The cattle were used primarily for their milk, which could be turned into butter and cheese, essential sources of nutrition during the colder months. The sheep were valued for their wool, which would be spun into yarn and woven into clothing and blankets. The pigs provided meat, which would be salted and stored for the winter months, ensuring that the family would have food even when the fields were barren. The chickens provided eggs and occasional meat for stews and soups. As summer arrived, the Viking farmer found themselves deep in the heart of the growing season. The fields, once empty and barren, were now lush and green, with rows of crops stretching across the horizon. The warmth of the sun helped the plants grow quickly, but the farmer knew that the weather could be unpredictable. A sudden frost, a long drought, or an early snowstorm could destroy everything in an instant. Yet the farmer continued to work the land, trusting that the careful preparation and the rhythms of the seasons would bring the fruits of their labor. The summer was also a time of harvesting. Barley, oats, and wheat were cut by hand using sickles and gathered into sheaves. The work was long and strenuous, with the farmer and their family working together in the fields, gathering the grain and bringing it back to the threshing floor, where it would be separated from the husks. The grain was then stored in granaries, carefully preserved for use throughout the year. The Vikings, though not known for their large-scale agriculture, were skilled at making the most of their land and ensuring that they had enough food to survive the winter. During the summer months, the Vikings also harvested fruits and berries from the land. Apples, berries, and plums were gathered, and some were preserved through drying or fermentation. Mead, the honey-based alcoholic beverage, was often brewed, and it became a central part of Viking feasts and social gatherings. This drink, with its rich sweetness, was a symbol of abundance and celebration, a reflection of the hard work that went into ensuring the Viking community had enough to eat and drink. As the days grew shorter and the cool winds of fall began to blow, the harvest season was in full swing. The Viking farmer would collect the last of the crops, storing the grains and vegetables to be used throughout the winter. The animals, too, needed to be prepared for the colder months. Some would be slaughtered for meat, which would be preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. The farmer knew that the winter months would bring hardship, but they also knew that with careful preparation, the family would have enough food to survive until the return of spring. The fall was also a time to gather firewood. With the long winters of the north, heat was essential for survival, and the hearth in the longhouse would need to be fed constantly. The Vikings were resourceful, using every part of the tree for fuel, building, and crafting. Even the smallest twig or branch was useful in the Viking world. The farmer would spend days chopping wood, preparing the house for the long winter months ahead. The days would grow colder, and the nights would stretch on, but the longhouse would be warm, filled with the crackle of the fire and the sounds of family working together to prepare for the harshest time of the year. When the cold grip of winter finally arrived, the Viking farmer would retreat indoors, their work for the season largely finished. The hearth in the longhouse would burn brightly, providing light and warmth against the darkness and cold. The family would huddle together in the warmth of the house, sharing meals and stories. The work of planting and harvesting was done, but the farmer was far from idle. Winter was a time for repairing tools, mending clothes, and preparing for the coming year. It was also a time for rest, for reflection, and for honoring the gods. The Viking farmer knew that the cycle of life was unbreakable, that each season would pass, and that a new one would come. The winter months would be a time of scarcity, but there would also be a time of preparation and reflection. The grain in the granaries, the meat in the smokehouse, and the warmth of the longhouse were all the result of the hard work and dedication of the family. They knew that survival was not just about individual effort, it was about the collective strength of the community, working together to weather the seasons and ensure that each family could endure. Even in the depths of winter, the Viking farmer held on to the belief that spring would return. the cycle would begin again. The seeds would be sown, the animals would be tended, and the land would be worked. The rhythms of nature were constant, unchanging, and the Viking farmer understood that their life was but a small part of this eternal cycle. The food that sustained the Viking farmer was not just nourishment, it was a connection to the land, to the gods, and to the community. Every grain of barley, every sheep's fleece, and every piece of smoked meat was a symbol of survival, of resilience, and of the unwavering will of the Viking people to endure. The food that filled their tables was not just sustenance, it was the essence of their way of life. A way of life that endured through the centuries, woven into the very fabric of their society. And so, as the Viking farmer rests in the warmth of the longhouse, with the fire crackling softly in the hearth, they can take comfort in the knowledge that the land will provide again. The seasons may change, but the work, the community, and the connection to the earth will remain. And in the quiet, peaceful hours of the night, the Viking farmer dreams of spring, of planting, of growth, and of a new beginning. Part 8. Viking Rituals and Beliefs. Sacred Practices of Life and Death. The life of a Viking farmer was not only shaped by the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the land, but also by a deep connection to the spiritual world. Religion and ritual were woven into the fabric of daily existence, offering a sense of purpose and understanding in a world often full of uncertainty. The Viking people believed that the forces of nature, gods, and ancestors were present in every aspect of life, guiding their actions, protecting their homes, and shaping their fate. For the Viking farmer, each day began with a quiet ritual, a moment of reflection and connection with the divine. As the first light of dawn broke over the land, the farmer might pause for a moment to honor Thor, the god of thunder and protector of crops, or Freya, the god of fertility and abundance. The Vikings' relationship with the gods was not distant or abstract, it was immediate and personal. The farmer might leave a small offering of bread, milk, or honey at the family's shrine, a simple gesture to invoke the gods' blessings for a bountiful harvest or for the safety of the family. These offerings were not meant to be grand or extravagant, but were made with sincerity, often in a quiet, humble way. The household shrine, or hof, was a sacred place within the Viking home. Often, this shrine would be a small wooden structure, perhaps adorned with carvings of the gods or images of animals that had spiritual significance. The farmer might light a candle or incense, offering a prayer for health and prosperity. The very act of offering something to the gods, no matter how small, was an expression of gratitude, acknowledging the interdependence between human beings and the forces that shaped their world. In addition to these everyday rituals, the Viking farmer also participated in more formal seasonal festivals, which were celebrated with great enthusiasm and community spirit. The most important of these was Yule, the winter festival that marked the return of the sun after the darkest days of the year. Yule was a time for feasting, storytelling, and honoring the gods. It was also a time to reflect on the past year and to seek divine guidance for the coming one. During Yule, families would gather around the hearth, sharing stories of the gods and ancestors, recounting the heroic deeds of their forefathers, and remembering the spirits of those who had passed. This was not just a celebration of the divine, but a time to honor the continuity of life, from the ancestors to the children yet to be born. The Yule log, a large piece of wood that was carefully selected and burned in the hearth, symbolized the warmth and light of the sun. The burning of the log was a ritual meant to ensure that the sun would return to the sky, bringing with it the warmth and fertility needed for the next growing season. As winter passed and the first signs of spring appeared, the Viking farmer would celebrate the arrival of Ostara, the festival of renewal and rebirth. Ostara marked the awakening of the land, a time when the first green shoots would appear in the fields and animals would begin to give birth. This was a time for honoring Frigg, the goddess of love and marriage, and Freya, the god of fertility. The Viking farmer would make offerings of eggs, flowers, and fresh fruits to these deities, symbols of new life and the promise of a good harvest. With the arrival of summer, The Midsummer Festival became a focal point of the Viking farmer's life. This festival celebrated the height of the sun's power and the abundance of the land. It was a time of joyous feasting, dancing, and revelry. The Viking farmer, after a long season of hard work, would take a moment to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Mead, brewed from honey, was often served in abundance, and the farmers would gather around the fire to celebrate the warmth of the sun and the gifts of the earth. At midsummer, the community came together to give thanks for the crops, the animals, and the continued protection of the gods. This was a time for bonding and for renewing the shared commitment to the survival of the group. The connection to the gods was not just about seeking favor for the living, it was also about honoring the dead. The Viking farmer would often take part in funeral rites, where the souls of the deceased were honored and sent to the afterlife. These rites, which could vary depending on the region and the specific beliefs of the family, were meant to ensure that the spirit of the deceased would find peace and favor with the gods. Valhalla, the Hall of the Slain, was a central part of Viking afterlife beliefs. It was said that those who died bravely in battle were chosen by Odin to dwell in Valhalla, where they would prepare for the final great battle, Ragnarok, while Valhalla was reserved for warriors who had met their end in battle. The Viking farmer's understanding of the afterlife was less focused on the glory of war and more on the connection between the living and the dead. The ancestors were honored regularly, with family members often visiting the burial mounds of their forebears to offer food, drinks, and prayers. The Viking farmer believed that the spirits of the ancestors were always present, watching over the family and offering guidance, protection, and wisdom. In times of hardship or uncertainty, the farmer might call upon their ancestors for strength and support. The rituals surrounding death were integral to the Viking farmer's sense of identity and connection to the past. When a loved one died, the body might be placed in a ship burial, or in some cases, a cremation would take place. The Viking believed that these rituals helped the deceased transition to the next world, ensuring that their spirit would be able to continue its journey. The rituals of death were not seen as something to fear, but as a natural part of life, a necessary transition that had to be respected and honored. In addition to these major seasonal festivals, there were numerous smaller rituals that took place throughout the year. The Viking farmer would often participate in, or sacrifices, made to the gods to seek favor for specific needs. If the farmer's crops were failing, they might offer a sacrifice to Freya for a good harvest. If an illness had taken root in the community, a sacrifice to Aya, the goddess of healing, might be made. These sacrifices, though sometimes involving the blood of animals, were not made out of malice but out of a deep respect for the god's power and the belief that the natural world was governed by divine forces that needed to be appeased. These acts of ritual and sacrifice were not done for personal gain or glory. They were acts of humility, a way of acknowledging that the Viking farmer was but one small part of a vast and intricate web of life. The farmer understood that the gods and spirits of the land were powerful forces, capable of shaping the world in ways beyond human control. The rituals and beliefs surrounding farming, life, death, and the seasons helped the Viking farmer understand their place in the world that was much larger and more mysterious than they could ever fully comprehend. The connection between the Viking farmer and the spiritual world was a deeply personal one, but it was also communal. The larger Viking society, whether living in a small settlement or a bustling coastal village, shared these same beliefs, rituals, and practices. Together, the people formed a bond that transcended time and space, connecting them to the gods, to their ancestors, and to each other. In this way, the Viking farmer was never truly alone, for they were always surrounded by the spirits of the land, the gods, and the ancestors, guiding them, protecting them, and offering wisdom through the rituals that were such an integral part of their lives. As night falls, the longhouse quiets, and the Viking farmer reflects on the day's work. They know that tomorrow will bring more toil, more effort, and more connection to the land and the gods. But for now, the fire flickers softly in the hearth, and the farmer's thoughts turned to the divine forces that shaped their world. In the stillness of the evening, the farmer can feel the presence of the gods and ancestors, watching over them, guiding them, and keeping them safe. And with that knowledge, they rest knowing that they are part of something far greater than themselves. Part 9. Viking Society and Family Life. The heartbeat of the community. Viking society was intricately woven together by the bonds of family, community, and shared responsibility. It was a society where every individual had a role to play, and each role was vital to the survival and prosperity of the group. At the heart of this system was the family, and within the family, the Viking farmer's daily life was centered around work, rest, and a deep sense of connection to those closest to them. The family unit was the cornerstone of Viking society. It was within the family that the values of hard work, loyalty, and honor were passed down through the generations. The Viking household was typically made up of a husband and wife, their children, and sometimes extended family members such as grandparents or aunts and uncles. In a small farming community, families often lived in close quarters, and their lives were intertwined. The longhouse, the central dwelling of the Viking farmstead, was a warm, communal space where the family spent much of their time together. Inside the longhouse, the hearth was the heart of the home. It was here that the family gathered for meals, shared stories, and kept warm during the cold winter months. The fire crackled in the center, providing both heat and light, while the roof above kept the weather at bay. The longhouse was often filled with the smells of roasting meat, baking bread, and herbal teas, as well as the sounds of children playing, adults working, and the occasional laughter that echoed through the rafters. Though life could be difficult, the warmth of the hearth and the presence of loved ones made the longhouse a place of comfort and security. The duties of the family members were clearly defined, yet they were flexible enough to adapt to the changing needs of the season. The Viking farmer's wife, often referred to as the housewife or frau, played a central role in managing the household. She would oversee the preparation of meals, the spinning of wool, the weaving of cloth, and the care of the children, while the husband tended to the fields, the livestock, and the construction of buildings. The wife ensured that the household was maintained, that food was prepared, and that the family's needs were met. She was the manager of the home, and her work was just as crucial to the survival of the family as the husband's work in the fields. In addition to their domestic duties, Viking women were skilled artisans. Many were proficient in spinning and weaving, creating clothing, blankets, and tapestries for their families. The wool they harvested from sheep, the flax they grew for linen, and the leather they tanned from animals all contributed to the family's material wealth. Viking women also had a deep knowledge of herbal remedies, which they passed down from generation to generation. The healer or wise woman was an important role within the Viking community, and the farmwife often played this part, using local plants and herbs to treat illnesses and injuries. The children of the Viking household, while often expected to help with chores from a young age, also had a unique place within the family structure. Boys were taught the ways of farming, animal husbandry, and the use of tools, as well as the skills needed to become warriors if the need arose. Girls, on the other hand, were trained in domestic skills, including cooking, weaving, and the care of livestock. Both boys and girls were also expected to learn the stories of their ancestors, the sagas that told of heroic deeds, gods, and legendary battles. These stories were not just entertainment, they were a way of passing down the values and history of the Viking people, ensuring that the traditions and culture were carried forward. The community itself played an important role in the daily life of the Viking farmer. Though many Viking settlements were small, they were closely knit, and everyone relied on each other for support. A Viking community, whether a village or a cluster of farms, was more than just a group of people living near each other. It was a cooperative network. The family was the primary unit, but the community was the foundation upon which that family's survival depended. During the planting and harvesting seasons, the farmers would often come together to help one another, Hearth feasts were common, where neighbors would gather in one family's longhouse to share the bounty of their labor. If a family was struggling with their harvest or had lost an animal, it was not uncommon for other families to come to their aid, lending a hand with the work or providing food. This sense of mutual support and collective responsibility was vital to the Vikings' ability to survive the harsh northern winters. Viking farmers understood the importance of trade, and it was not unusual for local markets to spring up in these small communities. Trade was an essential aspect of Viking life, especially during times when food or resources were scarce. Viking farmers would often barter goods such as grains, meat, furs, tools, and crafts for other necessities. A blacksmith might exchange a finely crafted axe for a sheep, or a carpenter might trade wooden furniture for flax or wool. The exchange of goods was more than just a commercial transaction. It was a way of building relationships, forging alliances, and strengthening the community. In the summer months, after the hard work of planting and tending crops had passed, the Viking farmer would often take part in local festivals and celebrations. These events were a way to honor the gods, celebrate the harvest, and bond with the community. Whether it was a feast in honor of Thor, a bonfire to celebrate midsummer, or a market day where families could buy and sell goods, these gatherings were a welcome break from the long, hard work of the fields. The role of the elderly in Viking society was also significant. Unlike in some cultures where older individuals were seen as a burden, the Vikings revered their elders for their wisdom and experience. Older members of the family and community were often called upon to offer counsel, resolve disputes, and teach the younger generations. Their knowledge of farming, healing, and storytelling was invaluable, and they were regarded with respect and admiration. At the end of a long day, when the work in the fields was done, the farmer would gather with their family around the hearth for a meal. This was a time of peace and quietude, where the cares of the day could be put aside, and the focus was on family and shared stories. The work of the day might have been exhausting, but it was done with the satisfaction of knowing that the family had contributed to the greater good of the community. Every meal shared around the hearth was not just about food, it was a reaffirmation of the ties that bound the family together. Though the Vikings are often remembered for their raids and battles, their daily lives were centered around the quiet, steady work of farming and community life. The battles and the raids were a part of their culture, but so too was the grind of daily survival. It was in the fields, in the longhouse, and in the rituals of daily life that the true essence of Viking society existed. The bonds of kinship and community were unbreakable. The Viking farmer lived not only for the success of their family, but for the well-being of the group as a whole. They knew that no one person could thrive without the support of others, and no individual success could be separated from the success of the community. The Viking world was one in which everyone contributed, everyone was needed, and everyone had a place. As the evening winds began to settle, and the sky grew darker, the Viking farmer would retire to the warmth of the longhouse, knowing that another day would begin with the light of dawn. The work would continue, the family would remain at the heart of the household, and the bonds of the community would endure. The Viking farmer, grounded in their connection to their family, their ancestors, and the land itself, could rest easy, knowing that they were part of something far larger than themselves, a community that would continue to thrive as long as the seasons passed, as long as the hearth continued to burn, and as long as the bonds of kinship remained strong. Part 10. Viking Tools and Technology. Crafting survival from the earth. In the Viking world, survival was a delicate balance of skill, knowledge, and the right tools. Whether cultivating crops, tending livestock, or building shelters, the Viking farmer's daily life was deeply intertwined with the tools they used. The Vikings were not only fierce warriors and explorers, but they were also incredibly skilled craftsmen, forging tools that were essential for both survival and the continuity of their way of life. The plough, one of the most essential tools for farming, was crucial for the cultivation of the land. Vikings were deeply connected to the soil, and their farming tools were built to withstand the harsh northern climates. The Viking plough was a heavy, sturdy piece of equipment designed to cut through tough, rocky soil. Unlike modern ploughs, which are often drawn by machines, the Viking plough was pulled by oxen or horses, which were carefully chosen for their strength and endurance. The team of oxen would work together to pull the plough through the fields, turning the earth and preparing it for planting. The Viking plough was often crafted from wood, with the iron tip helping to break through the ground. The ploughshares, the parts of the plough that made contact with the soil, were sometimes made from steel, a strong, durable material that could stand up to the wear and tear of daily use. The Vikings had mastered the art of ironworking, which allowed them to forge tools and weapons that were stronger and more effective. The craftsmanship that went into the construction of such tools was a testament to the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the Viking people. But farming wasn't just about ploughing. Sickles and scythes were also essential for harvesting crops. The Viking sickle, with its curved blade, was designed to cut through the grain stalks efficiently. After the grains were harvested, the farmer would use a flail, another important tool, to separate the grain from the husks. The flail consisted of a long wooden handle with a shorter wooden or metal striking piece attached by a chain. The farmer would swing the flail over a pile of harvested grain, beating it to loosen the kernels from the stalks. This process, known as threshing, was crucial for preparing the grain for storage and consumption. These tools were not just functional, they were also a reflection of the Vikings' deep understanding of the natural world. Each tool was crafted with an intimate knowledge of the materials available in their environment. The Vikings used a combination of wood, stone, bone, and metal to create tools that were both practical and durable. Bone handles, for example, might be used for smaller tools, while larger implements, such as axes and hammers, were crafted from iron or steel. The Viking smith, known for their expertise in metallurgy, was central to the Viking way of life, and their tools played an integral role in both farming and warfare. The axe, one of the most iconic Viking tools, had a dual purpose. Not only was it used in battle, but it was also indispensable for the Viking farmer. The axe was used for cutting down trees to build homes, barns, and fences. Timber was a critical resource in Viking society, and the axe was the primary tool for harvesting it. The longship, one of the most remarkable achievements of Viking engineering, was built from wood, and the construction of these ships required an intimate understanding of woodcraft. The axes used to fell trees and shape wood were often large and heavy, made to withstand repeated use. The Viking also used adses, which were tools with a flat blade used for smoothing and shaping wood. An adze would be used by the Viking carpenter to smooth out the rough surfaces of timber, creating planks and beams for the construction of homes, ships, and other essential buildings. The construction of the Viking longhouse was a careful, labor-intensive process. Timber was cut, shaped, and fitted into place using tools like the adze, which allowed the carpenter to achieve the precision needed for sturdy, lasting structures. Viking pottery and clay-based tools were also essential for daily life. The potter's wheel, though not as advanced as modern versions, was used to create storage jars, cooking pots, and bowls. These vessels were often made from clay, which was easily molded and fired. The pottery was used to store grains, liquids, and foodstuffs. Storage was particularly important in a land where harsh winters could render crops scarce. Clay vessels, when sealed properly, helped keep food fresh and protected from rodents. The Vikings also used stone tools for tasks such as grinding grain into flour. The quern was a small, hand-operated mill used to grind barley, oats, and other grains into flour. This tool was essential for the preparation of bread, porridge, and other staples of the Viking diet. Grain was placed between two large, flat stones, and the farmer would rotate a handle, grinding the grain into flour. This simple yet effective tool was used for centuries and was passed down from one generation to the next. Fishing was another important aspect of the Viking farmer's life, especially for those living near the coasts or along rivers. Fishhooks, made from bone, wood, or iron were used to catch fish in the lakes, rivers, and seas surrounding Viking settlements. The Vikings were expert fishermen, and their ability to catch and preserve fish played a crucial role in sustaining their diet. Some fishing techniques included the use of nets and weirs, which were traps set in the water to catch large numbers of fish at once. Even in their farming practices, the Vikings were masters of innovation. They understood the cycles of the land and adapted their tools and methods accordingly. For instance, the use of compost and manure was essential for enriching the soil and ensuring that crops thrived. The Vikings practiced a type of crop rotation, allowing the soil to recover by alternating between different types of crops each season. This method helped prevent the depletion of the soil and ensured that the Viking farmer could continue to grow food year after year. The Vikings also practiced livestock management, and the tools used for tending to animals were just as important as those for farming. Hoes, rakes, and shears were essential for managing animals, whether it was shearing sheep for wool or grooming horses for travel. The Vikings were skilled animal husbandmen, raising not only cattle and sheep, but also pigs, goats, and chickens. These animals provided the Viking farmer with food, clothing, materials, and even fertilizer for their crops. The tools for animal care were essential for maintaining the health and productivity of the livestock. As the seasons changed, so did the tools required by the Viking farmer. During the winter months, when snow and ice covered the land, the farmer would use sledges and sleds to move supplies and materials. These simple but effective tools allowed for the transportation of goods, even in the harshest conditions. The Vikings also used sled dogs to pull sledges across the snowy landscape, which was particularly useful for long-distance travel or when moving large amounts of food and supplies. Throughout the year, the Viking farmer would rely on a toolkit made up of carefully crafted implements that enabled them to complete a variety of tasks. These tools were not merely functional. They were an expression of the Vikings' relationship with the land and their understanding of nature's rhythms. Each tool was made with skill and precision, ensuring that it would last through the seasons and help the farmer meet the challenges of each new cycle of life. Even in the quietest moments, as the Viking farmer sat by the fire after a long day's work, the tools that surrounded them told the story of a life deeply connected to the land. The plow, the sickle, the axle were symbols of resilience and resourcefulness. They were not just tools, they were instruments of survival, carefully crafted by skilled hands to ensure that life continued in the face of the unpredictable elements of the northern world. In the stillness of the evening, as the embers of the fire glowed softly, the Viking farmer could rest with the knowledge that they were part of a tradition of craftsmanship that had sustained their people for generations. The tools of their trade were not just functional, they were a testament to the ingenuity of a society that had learned to live in harmony with the land, using the resources around them to create a life that was both rich in history and in survival. And in this quiet moment, surrounded by the tools that had shaped their world, the Viking farmer could feel a sense of peace, knowing that the labor of their hands and the knowledge passed down from their ancestors would continue to guide them season after season. Part 11: Viking Spirituality and Rituals. The gods in daily life. Viking spirituality was deeply entwined with their connection to the world around them. The gods and goddesses of Norse mythology played a vital role in the everyday life of the Viking farmer, whether it was the rituals to ensure a good harvest to honor the spirits of the land or to seek protection during a raid. Viking spirituality was not confined to the realm of the extraordinary. Was rooted in the everyday acts of living, working, and surviving in a harsh, unpredictable world. In Viking society, spirituality was not an abstract or distant concept. The gods were seen as active, living forces that influenced every aspect of life, from the fertility of the soil to the success of a sea voyage. The world was understood to be populated by a host of spiritual entities, gods, giants, spirits of ancestors, and land spirits, all of whom had a stake in the affairs of humans. The chief gods in Norse mythology, such as Odin, Thor, and Freya were central figures in the Viking spiritual life. Odin, the Allfather, was associated with wisdom, poetry, and war, while Thor, the god of thunder, was deeply revered for his protection of the land and the people. Freya, the goddess of love, fertility, and war, represented both the nurturing aspects of life and the fierce warrior spirit. These gods were invoked for various reasons, but they were always seen as deeply intertwined with human affairs. The Viking farmer, even in their quiet moments of working the fields or tending to livestock, would often have these deities in mind. It was not uncommon for a Viking to begin the day with a small prayer or ritual, offering thanks to the gods for the opportunities of the day ahead. These rituals were often simple yet meaningful, rooted in a sense of gratitude and reverence for the divine forces that guided their lives. One of the most important rituals in the Viking spiritual life was the practice of sacrifice. The Vikings believed that by offering something of value, whether it be an animal, a portion of their harvest, or even a human sacrifice, they could earn the favor of the gods and ensure a prosperous future. These sacrifices were typically made at which were seasonal festivals or ceremonies held to honor the gods. The Viking farmer, in particular, would make offerings to Freya, the god of fertility and agriculture, asking for good harvests, fertile animals, and the blessing of the land. Could take place at various times of the year, but the most significant were the midwinter, spring, and autumn festivals. The midwinter sacrifice was particularly important, as it marked the turning of the year and the hope for rebirth and renewal in the coming months. During this time, the Viking farmer might offer grain, meat, or dairy products, which were valuable commodities for the community. These offerings would be placed in a sacred space, such as a grove or an altar within the longhouse, where they would be burned or buried to honor the gods. Thor, the thunder god, was another key figure in the Viking spiritual world. His power to bring rain, control the seasons, and protect the crops made him one of the most widely revered deities among Viking farmers. During times of drought or when the crops were struggling, the Viking farmer might make an offering to Thor, hoping for his intervention to bring rain or to drive away harmful spirits. The farmer might create a small offering bowl filled with meat or beer, a favored beverage of the gods, and place it near their crops or in the center of the longhouse, asking for Thor's blessings for the coming harvest. The act of sacrifice was not limited to just material goods. Vikings also believed that the spirits of their ancestors played a crucial role in their daily lives. The farmer might honor their forebears by maintaining a small shrine or altar within the home, where they would place objects of significance, family heirlooms, weapons, tools, or personal tokens. These offerings were meant to honor the ancestors' spirits, who were thought to have the power to influence the present. By keeping the ancestors close, the Viking farmer could call on their wisdom and strength when needed. The spirits of the dead were believed to be ever present, watching over the living and guiding them in their decisions. Viking spirituality was not confined to formal ceremonies. It was also present in the everyday actions and rituals that made up the cycle of life. The daily routines of the Viking farmer were often imbued with sacred significance. For example, before going to the fields, the farmer might stand at the edge of their property and offer a silent prayer to the land spirits, asking for their protection and blessings. They might touch the soil as a reminder of their deep connection to the earth and the harvest it would bring. In this way, the farmer's work was not just physical labor, it was an act of spiritual devotion. The importance of nature in Viking spirituality cannot be overstated. The Vikings saw themselves as deeply connected to the land, the sky, and the seas. The changing seasons were not just cycles of weather, they were seen as divine patterns, reflective of the eternal struggle between life and death, growth and decay. The winter solstice, for instance, was a time of great significance, as it marked the darkest point of the year before the return of the light. This was a time for the farmer to reflect on the past year and make offerings to the gods, thanking them for the blessings of the harvest and seeking guidance for the year to come. The sacred trees and groves were also essential in Viking spirituality. Trees, particularly oak and ash, were considered sacred and were often associated with the gods. The Yggdrasil, the great world tree, was at the center of the cosmos, connecting the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. For the Viking farmer, trees were not only sources of timber and fuel, but were also thought to be living entities with a deep connection to the spiritual world. It was common to leave offerings at the base of sacred trees, asking for the gods' protection and for blessings on the land. Ritual feasts were another important part of Viking spirituality. These feasts were not just times of social gathering, they were also occasions for honoring the gods and the spirits. At the center of the feast was the horn of mead, which was passed around and drunk in honor of the gods. Mead, a fermented drink made from honey, water, and herbs, was considered a sacred beverage, and it was believed that the gods themselves drank from the mead. The farmer would partake in these rituals, offering a portion of their mead to the gods as a token of thanks for the blessings of the earth. While the gods were honored in many ways, they were also believed to have direct influence over the practical aspects of the farmer's life. The Vikings understood that the world was a place of constant flux. Seasons shifted, crops grew and withered, animals lived and died. In this world of change, the farmer sought the favor of the gods to maintain balance and stability. When times were good, the farmer would offer thanks for the abundance of the harvest. When times were hard, they would ask for strength and protection. The connection between the farmer and the gods was reciprocal. The gods did not simply give blessings, they required respect and offerings in return. This mutual exchange was at the core of Viking spirituality, the belief that the gods were not distant, untouchable beings, but active participants in the lives of those who honored them. It was through this relationship that the Viking farmer found a sense of purpose and grounding. Their work was not just about survival, it was about honoring the sacred rhythms of the world. In the evenings, after the work of the day had been done, the Viking farmer might sit by the fire with their family and recount the sagas and stories of the gods and heroes. These stories, passed down through generations, were more than just entertainment. They were ways of keeping the divine close, of remembering the importance of honor, loyalty, and courage. The Norse sagas, with their tales of gods, giants, and legendary heroes, were an integral part of the Viking spiritual experience. In this way, the everyday life of the Viking farmer was inseparable from the divine forces they revered. As the night settled over the longhouse with the fire crackling softly in the hearth, the Viking farmer could rest, knowing that they were part of a vast, interconnected web of life, one that included the gods, their ancestors, and the spirits of the land. Every prayer, every offering, every act of daily labor was a part of a larger, divine cycle. The farmer's life, though filled with hardship and toil, was also rich with spiritual meaning and connection. Part 12. The Viking Legacy. Reflections on life, death, and survival. As the seasons passed and the world continued its eternal cycle of change, the Vikings remained steadfast in their way of life. Their legacy, woven from the fabric of myth, legend, and practical survival, endures long after their time on the world stage. Yet, for all the glory of their raids, their conquests, and their exploration, it was the simple, everyday life of the Viking farmer that anchored the heart of their civilization. These farmers, with their skilled hands and deep connection to the land, ensured that the Vikings thrived in one of the harshest environments on earth. The life of a Viking farmer was not easy. It was a life marked by long hours of labor, constant vigilance, and a deep understanding of the natural world. Yet, there was also a profound sense of purpose in the Vikings' connection to the earth. Every plow through the soil, every sheep sheared, every meal shared with family was an act of devotion to the land and to the generations who had come before. The Viking farmer understood that their survival depended not just on strength and cunning, but on the rhythm of the seasons, the cycles of life and death, and the intricate relationship they had with the world around them. The Viking worldview was fundamentally shaped by an understanding of fate. In Viking mythology, the Norns, Three mystical women who controlled the destinies of all beings, spun the threads of life and death. These threads wove through the lives of every Viking, from the moment of birth to the final moments of life. In this worldview, death was not something to be feared. It was simply another part of the natural cycle. The Viking farmer, like all members of Viking society, would have known that their time would come. But it was how they lived and how they contributed to their community that truly mattered. Death, for the Viking, was not the end, but a transition. The Viking funeral, a solemn yet revered event, was seen as a passage into the afterlife. The burial rituals, which often included placing a person's tools, weapons, and personal items in the grave, reflected the belief that life continued beyond the physical realm. Some Vikings were honored with ship burials, where they were laid to rest in a boat, surrounded by their belongings, to ensure a safe journey to the afterlife. For the Viking farmer, this was not a morbid ritual, but an acknowledgement of the cyclical nature of existence. This belief in the afterlife was reflected in the Vikings' reverence for their ancestors. The dead were not forgotten. They were celebrated and honored. The spirits of the ancestors were thought to be an active part of the community, offering guidance and protection. The Viking farmer, through rituals and offerings, sought to maintain a strong connection with those who had gone before, drawing strength and wisdom from the generations that had shaped their world. These ancestral spirits were seen as guardians, ensuring that the Viking way of life would continue and that the land would remain fruitful for future generations. In the face of the harsh realities of life in the north, the Vikings developed a profound respect for the forces of nature. The land, sea, and sky were sacred to them, and they understood the delicate balance that existed between humanity and the natural world. The Viking farmer was not simply a worker of the land, they were a steward of it. They recognized that the earth gave them sustenance, but it also demanded respect and careful management. Every year, the farmer would make offerings to the gods, asking for a good harvest, a healthy flock, and protection from the storms that could easily devastate their homes and livelihoods. The farming year was not just a cycle of planting and harvesting, it was a journey that mirrored the human experience. The Viking farmer, in their humble work, understood that survival required patience, persistence, and adaptability. Just as the earth could be harsh and unforgiving, so too could life itself. Yet, through perseverance and hard work, the Viking farmer found meaning in the struggle, knowing that every season brought with it the opportunity for growth and renewal. But it wasn't only the gods who played a role in the Vikings' worldview. The forces of chaos and order were in constant tension. The giants, the forces of destruction and chaos in Viking mythology, were always lurking, threatening to upend the careful balance that the Vikings sought to maintain. The Vikings were acutely aware of the fragility of their world, and they constantly worked to safeguard their homes, their farms, and their communities from the unpredictable forces that could bring destruction. In this context, the Viking warrior and the Viking farmer were not separate entities, they were part of the same whole. The Viking warrior fought to defend their land and their people, while the Viking farmer labored to provide for them. The two roles, though seemingly different, were united by a shared purpose: the survival and prosperity of the Viking community. The warrior depended on the farmer for sustenance, and the farmer depended on the warrior for protection. Together, they formed the foundation of Viking society, each playing a critical part in the larger story of Viking civilization. This balance between work and defense, labor and protection, was reflected in the Vikings' rituals and beliefs. While the farmer worked the land and cared for the animals, the warrior would protect the village and the community from external threats. But even the warrior had to be prepared for the agricultural cycles. They too had a deep respect for the land, for the gods, and for the seasons. Many Viking warriors would return home in the off-season to help with the harvest or to ensure that their families were well taken care of. In the quiet moments, as the farmer looked out over their fields, they could sense the deep continuity of life. The same soil their ancestors had tilled, the same winds that had shaped their land, were still present in every grain of wheat, every woolen sheep, and every gust of breeze that swept across the fields. The farmer could feel the presence of the past in the quiet hum of daily life. The work might be exhausting, but it was deeply satisfying. The knowledge that their labor would feed their community, protect their family, and ensure that the Viking way of life would continue was a comfort. In the evening, as the sun set behind the hills, the farmer would often pause to reflect. The days were long, and the work was hard, but each season brought with it the possibility of renewal. The cycles of planting, growing, and harvesting were more than just routines. They were a reflection of the larger cycles of existence. Life and death were not opposites, but part of a single, interconnected process. Every year, the earth would give life, and every year, it would take it away. In this rhythm, there was meaning and purpose. The Viking farmer understood that survival wasn't guaranteed. The harsh northern winters, the unpredictable weather, the looming threat of invaders, all of these were constant concerns. Yet, in spite of these challenges, the Viking farmer found resilience. They drew strength not just from their tools or their knowledge of the land, but from the legacy of their people, from the gods who watched over them, and from the ancestors who had come before them. And so, as the night descended, with the crackling fire casting long shadows in the longhouse, the Viking farmer could rest, knowing that they were part of something greater. The tools they used, the rituals they practiced, and the labor they performed were all pieces of a larger tapestry that spanned generations. The Viking way of life, with all its challenges and triumphs, would continue, carried forward by the hands of those who had learned to live in harmony with the land, to respect the gods, and to honor the spirits of their ancestors. In the quiet of the night, the Viking farmer's heart would be at peace. Their work was done for the day, and the rhythms of life would continue as they had for centuries. The land, the gods, and the spirits of the past were with them, guiding them through the darkness of winter and into the light of spring. And though the seasons would change and time would pass, the cycle of life, death, and survival would remain eternal. The Viking legacy woven from the soil, the sea, and the sky would live on, carried by the hands of those who understood the delicate balance of the world they had inherited. Until next time, stay safe, and see you in the next history.